So I made some videos before when I didn't have any clue what I was doing with making videos, and this one's probably not going to be that much better, but I'm going to try to revamp my original videos to talk about a couple things, and I still have the original sheets that made me spaghetti talk, so this should be fun. Anyway, I wanted to talk about personality typing and what it is to start out with. Especially the 16 personalities people kind of know about with the Myers and Briggs 16 personalities. It's really 16 different cognitive function stack orders that a human's brain operates from. Um, and that's based off of four main functions with two different attitude expressions. Our two perceiving functions, how we perceive the world, are intuition and sensing. Intuition is the intangible form of sensing, and sensing includes your five senses for the tangible realm. Our two judging functions, how we judge things, how we differentiate, how we determine things, are feeling and thinking. Feelings are the intangible form, and thinking is the more tangible form of that. Then the two attitude expressions that I'm talking about that take it up to a total of eight functions that we operate from, all of us operate from the same eight functions. That is introverted or extroverted. Introverted brings the information more interpersonal with us personally, and extroverted helps us connect with the outer world. So I'm just going to use an INFJ. INFJ is known by many names. Advocate, seer are two of them. And they have introverted intuition as their main function. We call the main function there's many names. I call it the ruler or the king and queen, but it gets called the operations manager, the apex, the control function, okay? Oh, the hero, that's another word for it. Then the second function that an INFJ has is extroverted feeling. And let's see. Okay, the second function placement. The reason I'm telling you titles for them is they have like a character role or an archetype that they behave like in each of these. So that first function of intuition for an INFJ is like their operations manager. It's the command center. None of the other functions get to determine anything without that giving the final stamp of approval, like a king or a queen or a ruler with the official ring, signet, seal. Operations manager, apex manager, or the hero of the show, right? Okay, so the second function for them is extroverted feeling, and that gets called the auxiliary function because it's always being used in some form as well. It also gets called the parent function because it tends to be like a parental restrictor within the ego. And I call it the advisory counselor or the advisory counselor function because like with a king and a queen, they have that top advisor or top advisors that help them make their determinations for the kingdom. So the third function for an INFJ is introverted thinking, and the third function is called the tertiary function. It's also called the eternal child, and that's what I call it too, like a prince or a princess, but they get to grow up. The eternal child doesn't really fully mature. It's always got like a childlike, innocent nature to it. That function is like your rest, relaxation, restore function. It's the function that when you use it in your ego, it actually helps you revive yourself, heal yourself, rest, restore, relax. It brings you back into a balanced state within your ego. The more you get to use that function. Also, the hero function or the king has a special bond with the eternal child or the tertiary because, well, a hero isn't a hero without a kid to admire it, and the king it doesn't really have a legacy kingdom if they don't have a child to inherit it as the legacy. So they're both really strong functions. The top three are really strong functions. All four, there's a fourth function within your ego. For the INFJ, that's extroverted sensing. So that fourth function is called the inferior function. It's also called the anima and animus, and I call it the subordinate function. Again, you think about subordinates would be like the citizens or the community within a kingdom. I kind of gave my whole thing a kingdom format to explain it. So you can get an idea of the behavior of that. In one kind of kingdom, the citizens don't get much free will choice. And then in another kind of kingdom, it's almost like a democracy or a republic, and the citizens are pretty much citizens, free will, but until they get seen as capable without so much regulation, it's more of an inferiority in the kingdom. They get regulated and it doesn't get used as much. So your fourth function in your ego is actually the weakest function, and it needs strengthened because, well, okay, it's where all your insecurities lay, okay? And until you deal with those insecurities, it's going to trigger defense mechanisms, which I'll get into here with the four sides of the mind. So another thing about the fourth function before I move on is, as anima animus, it's also how you find your mate in life, or the person that you fall in love with, or how you fall in love. We kind of tend to project that onto somebody that we think we see that quality in, and then the rose-colored glasses fall off and we find out whether we were correct or not. Now, if we have it integrated, then we don't have to project it so much, and we can actually recognize it in other people. But whatever your fourth function is, you're looking for a partner, seeking out a partner that has that in a stronger position that you feel comfortable with. That's how that works out. So that's the first side of the mind, the ego. That's your personality type when you take one of these MBTI or cognitive function personality tests, because MBTI is just like a brand, okay, named after the sisters that group together the 16 possible cognitive function stack types from Carl Jung's original cognitive function theory on the four expressions: thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensing, with two attitudes, introverted and extroverted. Now, you can't just operate off the four in your ego, though, because, like I said, there's 8 expressions total. So you also have your shadow side. That is your id. Freud called it the id. And that's also what people call your inner child. These personality types are getting wiser, and they're telling you about your shadow side too, but that's still only 50% of the equation, but we're going to get there, okay? So to look at the shadow side of an INFJ and talk about these placements, their top function in their shadow or their inner child or id. Let me first explain that the theory is, when you're born, you're actually born in your unconscious id. Your id is more unconscious, whereas your ego is fully conscious to make decisions, differentiate, pass judgment, etc., right? Your id is unconscious. But just like a newborn baby born in that state, it's where all your hopes, dreams, and desires lay, okay? It's got issues with instant gratification and all your needs and wants, right? So when you're born, just like a baby cries because they're hungry, even if they could wait a little bit, they don't know that they could wait. So, instant gratification, they need that, they're going to cry until they get it. Same with a wet diaper, the same with anything else, right? So the id shadow is kind of like a little baby that needs to grow up through the course of your life and mature. Okay, I explained that. It creates the ego in order to be like an overall parental or regulatory responsible segment of the mind to protect it, okay? So I explained to some people the 4 mindsets like a quantum computer. And the ego is your main operating system, and it works in tandem with the id shadow as not a backup system, but a secondary system that holds half of the applications, although ego does all the processing, okay? That's why it's quantum. It's got 2 systems in one to hold all the applications that you need to use, even though the main system of ego does all the processing, okay? Ego establishment is about law and order and responsibility. id shadow, that inner child, grows up through the course of your time. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, but there's a reason for this. And the lesson about id shadow maturity and later on integration is where wisdom is. Okay. When the child grows up, they become more wise. Okay. It's also where your true self hides. So that's where you hit individuation, where you grow, where you integrate the id shadow. But you can't just go from ego to id for integration. You have to learn about these other two mindsets, which is something that MBTI and a lot of these personality type consultings miss. Okay. So let me finish running down. The shadow. The top function in the shadow for an INFJ to continue that is extroverted intuition. It's got the opposite attitude expression of the first function in ego. Same function order, different attitude expressions, so that you have access to all, I'm holding up 4, but all 8 functions. Okay. So the top function in your id shadow is called an oppositional. One person calls it. It's also John Beebe, or BB, is the one that really started talking about the shadow functions and the archetypal character expressions of all 8 functions, including shadow, instead of just your ego personality type. And he's still alive. He's a more contemporary psychologist today than Carl Jung, where this theory stemmed from about 100 and some years ago. So anyway, the first function in the id shadow is oppositional. It's also called a warrior. I call it the war chief because I have a kingdom analogy for that. You have to have a war counselor in every kingdom, okay? Even if you want to have a peaceful kingdom, you got to have somebody there that handles the defense system. And that's exactly what it does. Anytime that the king is threatened, the war chief is going to step out and do whatever it takes to keep the top function of ego protected, okay? So it can get paranoid, it can get sketchy, it can also do good things, okay, to keep the king protected, or the hero, or the top function, right? Okay. The second function in your shadow, it gets called a witch or a senex. I like to call it the critical crone, okay? It's that little pessimistic voice on your shoulder, whichever shoulder you want to put it on, okay? That makes you question yourself all the time. Whatever functions in that place is the one that makes you question yourself the most. For an INFJ, it is introverted feeling. Now I'm going to explain this to you a little bit with this function, because critical crone is one that you really need to control to not allow yourself to be so swayed by the world around you, okay? For INFJ, in their ego, they have extroverted feeling as their advisor. That makes them pretty empathic. I didn't say empathetic, I said empathic, okay? Because they have a very strong position for being able to tune in and pick up on the environmental emotional field. They can pick up on other people's emotions. I think people call that clairsentient, but I'm just telling you how it breaks down in psychology, right through the cognitive function stack. We've all got different gifts according to our function stack, okay? So in their ego, where they can recognize things, they actually recognize other people's emotions much more clearer than they can recognize their own half the time. Not that they don't recognize their own, but when they do, their own come with somewhat of a pessimistic or a critical undertone to it. So say an INFJ is having a debate with someone and they both have different feelings in a situation. The feelings get heated, they have different views, and they can tell that their feelings don't match up. Well, an INFJ has to learn to accept their own feelings as valid as well, because they will tend to throw their own feelings under the bus to keep the other person comfortable, and then later on they regret it because they didn't speak up for themselves, because a lot of times the other person of a different type wouldn't have been so heated if they just could have told the difference, explain their side and allow the person to learn a lesson on how diversity is good. And we don't always, sometimes we have to agree to disagree, and that's something an INFJ knows well, but for some reason they just want to make other people comfortable to the own detriment of their own discomfort sometimes. And their critical crone is feelings. For some types, their critical crone is introverted thinking, and they never think that they're logical enough. Everybody else is smarter than them. Everybody else seems to know more than them, so they'll question their own thinking on a matter and not trust their own thoughts, even if they're right. So, yeah, whatever's in that position can kind of give a person a hiccup, and that's why you got to do shadow work. So that's the second function in the shadow. The third function in the shadow matches up with the eternal child and the ego. It is called trickster. I call it the tricky jester, tying it back into the kingdom theory. And it's just like that. It's trickster. It's like a double binder. It will do tricky things to throw a loop or a speed bump in your path as well as other people's paths, especially when it feels like the eternal child function, which, remember, relaxes you, restores you, and revives you. It's a very important function. It's a very innocent function in an ego. If it feels threatened, the trickster is going to be one of the first ones to step in, and it is going to get the critical crone to support it and the war chief to support it. But it's going to be the trickster setting that off. The trickster has a very special connection with the child. Again, you can think about the child and the hero having a special connection and ego. Well, between the ego and shadow, the trickster and the child have a special connection because that's the entertainment when you think about a kingdom, okay? So and again, what would an entertainer be without somebody to entertain? So it's kind of a blind spot for people too sometimes. It's one of the harder ones in the shadow for people to recognize their own mishap behavior with. For an INFJ, that's extroverted thinking. So sometimes they can be a little stubborn on hearing another person's analytics on a subject. They're not quick to want to change a method. If the method that they've done in the past worked fine, why change it? Even if the other method is better, that would be a trickster issue. Okay, what works works. Why change it if it ain't broken? That's a TE trickster right there, because sometimes you do want to change it even if it ain't broken because there's a better method and you don't have to go in 10 circles if you only need 2 to achieve your goal. The fourth function in your id shadow is the last of them, and it's one of the most uncomfortable functions for you to use and deal with, and a lot of times we try to avoid it and shut it off. And this function traditionally is called the demon or the daemon function. I call it the savage beast or the tame pet once you integrate it and work with it and heal it, okay? So, and it's just like that. That function, if it's triggered in a negative way, is the one that would tell a person, we're going to burn this whole house down with everybody in it. It will take you down as well as everybody else. It won't just bind you in a situation to learn from like the trickster. It will destroy. Okay? It's uncomfortable. It wears you out. It stresses you out even more than the inferior function that is its pairing. Remember, I said the inferior function holds your insecurities. Well, when your insecurities get triggered, first you go into subconscious defender mindset to defend yourself. But when that doesn't work, you go into the shadow, and these functions get tripped in negative ways within the shadow, which is what we're talking about right now, shadow it. That demon function, when you do the shadow work and healing, it can become like a beneficial angel instead of a demon in the way it reacts. Everybody has a demon to work with inside themselves, okay? Interesting when it comes to religion. Something that they need to tame. Again, I call it savage beast. You think about it in a kingdom, somebody's got, their exotic pet leopard, right? And if they don't tame that leopard ever and they let it out of a cage, it's going to go around eating kids in the kingdom all day long, right? But if they work with that pet leopard and they tame it, then that pet leopard can walk around in the kingdom without any leash or chains at all, and kids can ride on it and play with it, and it's like a giant pet house cat, right? So, again, another reason to do shadow work, so that we're not eating people alive with our demon function. So for an INFJ, to give an example of this again, I think part of the reason that this type tends to actually get into psychology work is because it's necessary for them, because their demon function is introverted sensing. Again, I talked about how extroverted functions help you tie more to the external world. Well, introverted functions give you that correlation to yourself. In the INFJ ego, everybody has two extroverted and two introverted in both their ego and their shadow, right? In the INFJ ego, their introverted functions are their hero and their child, okay? INFJs love to study too because their child function is introverted thinking. They're like a little scientist on wheels. They make great researchers and they're always wanting to learn something new. But their extroverted functions are extroverted feeling, like I said, that empathic nature, and extroverted sensing. So they're highly acute aware of their external environment and what the details of their external environment, although it's an insecurity for them. So they might try to zone it out and daydream a little bit when they get tired using that function in their ego. Um, I know I'm a daydreamer as an INFJ. So it's a way that they can relax and not use that function, and they zone out their environment, right? So that they don't get worn out when they're trying to restore. Anyway, in the shadow side, the parallel to that demon or savage beast function, the last one, it's introverted sensing. Well, introverted sensing is your own attunement with your body, taking care of your body, your health needs. It's also where your memories, sense of duty, and loyalty lay. So for the INFJ, if they get triggered in negative manners, they can just totally shut down and even forget to take care of themselves. Instead of just saying, well, I need to stop interacting or helping this person, being loyal to this person that has done me wrong, and I need to step back and take care of myself, they just quit altogether. They don't take care of themselves, or they release the other person, but they just sit there and they spin their wheels in insecurities. But they won't eat, they won't drink, they won't, they'll shut themselves down a lot of the times. And we can also have addiction issues. We can have sleep, just health issues from not taking care of yourself correctly. Don't drink enough water, you're going to have a problem. Drink some water. Okay. Their memories go sour. With introverted sensing, that's also where your memories sit, like reminiscing memories of the past. So with that in their demon function, they tend to remember more of the negative or the bad memories with much more detail than the positive ones until it gets integrated and healed. So yeah. Anyway, I gave an example. I used myself. That's pretty deep for you to know those my kryptonite and stuff, but it is what it is, and I've been doing the shadow work, so I'm good with that. We want to move into another mindset, though. So that's only half the equation. You have two backup systems to this quantum dual system that are like backup and cooling support systems for each of these two systems over here. And the one that is backup for ego is the subconscious defender. The one that is backup for the id shadow or the inner child is the superego. Okay? Now, the subconscious defender teaches humbleness and humility. The superego teaches reconciliation and release. I'm telling you what they teach too. These are why we integrate. You have to integrate, you have to humble the subconscious defender and integrate the subconscious defender into the ego stronger to strengthen the ego before you can actually do the shadow work to integrate the id. Okay? That's actually represented in the Bible. Look at the story of Jesus. He explains his life models these four turnings, and so does the scripture. So the subconscious defender has all the same functions and the same attitude expressions as your ego They're just flipped in the reverse order, which means that the king sits back, your lead function sits back, and they allow the subordinates or the inferior function, the insecurity function, to run the show like they're the lead function. Okay? It's a defense, but it also, as you work with it, this is why you need to humble it and strengthen it in a positive manner instead of defense mode and backlashing at people and projecting instead of introspecting. That strengthens those lower functions within your ego when you use that backup system. It's like a mirror. So I explained that pretty good. I don't need to run through all the functions again, besides explaining that it's the same functions in reverse order. The 4 mindsets means you literally have 4 personality types, but your ego is the one that MBTI or cognitive function points out when you do a personality type test. I can tell you what all 4 personality types are and how to strengthen them all through the process individually by the functions and their placements. Okay, if you humble the subconscious defender, that's how you can offer somebody what the Bible calls mercy. Okay, it's also where you reach self-actualization, because a lot of people go through life in the beginning of their life where all they can recognize in themselves is their weaknesses. And then there's a lot of other people that go through life in the first part of their life where all they can recognize is their strengths and ignore their weaknesses. Well, self-actualization is being able to see both your strengths and your weaknesses and the balance between the two to show who you self-actualize, who realize what your strengths and your weaknesses are and how you can work with those to navigate the environment as a more balanced human. We've all got them. Once that happens, the humbling occurs, then you get like a more open peek, because that's subconscious, okay? You get a better peek into the unconscious realm of the id shadow. And that's when you can start healing the inner child in the shadow and reach individuation. Now, individuation is more about discovering more of your uniqueness, who you are, answering those questions everybody asks. Why am I here? What is my purpose? My individual purpose? How do I go about it? How do I navigate where other people don't understand it, but I need to do this? You know, all those things get dealt with in the shadow. And that's individuation. That's how you step into your own ministry or life purpose. All this work will help you not only understand yourself better, but understand other people and be able to relate to other people that are different types than you as well, to learn about it. So now I'm going to go to the superego. The superego is reconciliation and release, and that is where grace comes from. It's also where forgiveness comes from. And it is the place where blame and shame and guilt go to die. The superego is your id shadow functions in reverse order. And if you were to compare it to your ego, it is everything opposite of your ego, the main center that you use to do all perception and judgment and differentiation through. Okay? It is the most opposite, polar opposite you can get. That's why, think about Joker and Batman. Joker wasn't so bad until he flipped into his superego. I mean, yes, he was bad. He got mixed up in this crowd and became a criminal. And then the criminals backstabbed him, and that destroyed his inner child because he was already in a broken state, and his inner child wasn't healed. And then the inner child was attacked so heavily that he flipped over into superego. Okay, a lot of mental health issues if somebody flips into superego too early in life before the time is appropriate or tries to live in it, because you need a healthy ego. Okay, you're integrating things in. You're not erasing the ego like some people think. So, yeah, superego, like I said, it's where forgiveness, grace, guilt, shame, all that rest. So we tap into these sides in healthy and unhealthy ways through different environment and situational experiences, but we also have the integration process. So now I'm going to talk about that. We start to establish ego around the onset of puberty. Before puberty, we kind of jump through all four mindsets in an exploratory fashion, with ego and the id shadow being the two strongest, but we don't settle anywhere. We use what we need in the functions, okay? But then around the time of puberty, we start to establish ego, solidify it, right? That lesson and what's going to make us responsible, create law and order in our lives to become adults. That lesson tends to go on until somewhere around age 30. This was exemplified with Jesus going into the temple at age 12 to preach. His parents left. They come back after 3 days' journey in their caravan to realize the kid's gone. They find him in the temple. They're like, "What'd you do that for?" And he's like, "Well, I needed to be about my business." He already knew his life purpose because who he was, but we won't go into all the religion. I want to give the example. And then because he followed the commandments, he went with his parents. He humbled himself. He was already humble, went with his parents, and went home until he was mature enough to go out on his own. Well, he doesn't show back up on the scene until close to age 30. If you've learned anything about the human mind, the frontal lobe is where we do our rational decision making, the prefrontal cortex, and it's the last area to fully develop. And it actually isn't even fully developed in our young adults today. When they leave their homes and get called adults, it's actually somewhere around the age of 25 to 28, depending on girl or boy, where it really finalizes its development. So Jesus showed back up on the scene to be baptized by John the Baptist, an outward display of humbling, okay, at age 30. So I'm just going to say age 30, okay? And then right after that, and that is biologically set with puberty, okay? But to do the integration process of the subconscious defender and the id shadow, there's really not a set time, even though I give a natural time frame that life does this, like 15-year chunks for each of them, okay? The more that you do the work, the quicker you can jump into your life purpose and heal those things after the age of 25, 28, 30, okay? And you can step into your purpose much earlier in life. And I think that's why Jesus said, "I go on to be with my Father, but you will do greater things." You figure that out sooner, you heal yourself, you can start your ministry sooner, and it won't just be a 3-year ministry. It can be a 40-year ministry before you get old, okay? Well, anyway, he exemplified the integration of the subconscious defender, the humbling, when he got baptized, and then he began the test for that humbling in the 40 days in the desert. The 40 days in the desert was his whole humbling integration. And he was tested of 3 things, and it actually ties into 3 of the id shadow functions when you look at it. I think it's the bread to stone, which was the critical crone being a pessimist. It was jump from this rock and let your angels catch you. That was the trickster. And then it was at the pinnacle of the mountain, or at the pinnacle of the church, bow down to me and I'll give you the whole world. And that was the demon function, you know. Satan's like giving him an offer, okay? So that was him humbling himself to not allow those functions to go out of control. Well, when he left the 40 days in the desert, then what happened? He was walking in wisdom because he did this subconscious defender integration, and he stepped into the shadow being healed, and he was ready to fulfill his life purpose. And he went out and he got his disciples, and he did his 3 years of ministry before he finished his job to move on to the next stage of it. So, so I, like I said, that can go quicker, although my experience was about 5 years with the shadow and about 9 years with the subconscious defender, and they kind of meshed together, and it was a hot mess. And I think it is in everybody's life. I'm sure it was for him too, honestly. So anyway, yeah, okay, I talked about that. Now, it also says in the Bible that we have to enter into heaven like children. Well, once you integrate your shadow id, that's your inner child, okay? So an integrated individual, balanced individual, not allowing their critic, their warrior, their trickster, and their savage beast or demon to rule their lives in unruly, unconscious manners, to be conscious, aware of your choices and make sound judgments. Because now you've got a bigger council board and you can see the whole show of everything you have to work with. You bring the shadow into the light and you expose it. Okay. Now, the superego gets integrated too, but that actually doesn't happen until closer to the end of life. It's like when your mind starts to recognize its frailty. I think it's a little biologically set somehow too. And it gets integrated for reconciliation and release, healing, to be able to let go of some of these things you weren't able to let go of in your ego before you transfigure and pass on to your next stage of life, the spirit realm, if you believe in that or you don't, or I'm just saying it like it is, okay? And that's where I told you it's about where guilt and shame go to die. It's where forgiveness sits. It's release, right? And so that's like after 75 at least with the human lifespan. Some people it's in the last month before they pass. Some people, I think it happens in the last minutes before they pass, if they pass in an unknown fashion, like, an accident or something. Now, when it comes to the subconscious defender, see, you can kind of see these, like, for the ego, it's a quarter life crisis the teenagers are going through. We already hear the midlife crisis. That's humbling the subconscious defender, what we call the midlife crisis. Okay, there's also a 3/4 life crisis. That's where someone around like 55 or so to 70 is starting to integrate that inner child again. And you hear wisdom of the elderly. Well, they're stepping back into that shadow and they're healing that inner child. Okay, and then the last one is the death crisis, the final crisis, and that's the release, right? So I think I talked about those things pretty well, and I'll talk about the other stuff in another video. I can also make another video to talk about the functions themselves, but I just wanted to explain the 4 mindsets and the integration process. If you don't know your type, I can help you find out your type. That's what I do as a consultant. I can also help you map out how to go through this important work of strengthening some of those weaker functions, identifying, self-actualization, where you're at on the map of life to do this work. Anyway, we'll talk about that in another video. Thanks for listening.